Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergasters, my name is Maceland and it is time for Guild Wars 2 On Point Combat Basics. In today's video we're going to talk about damage stat scaling with a focus on strike damage. Strike damage is all direct damage that is applied to enemies, so everything that you can find in skill tooltips labeled as damage on top. A total of 6 factors influence strike damage: weapon strength, scaling coefficients, power, precision and ferocity, and the target's armor. In order to get an understanding of all of those, we're going to talk about base damage and scaling first, and then focus on critical hits, provide a little summary and talk about some interactions between the stat combinations, and finally do a practical example to verify the math that I'm using. So let's start with base damage and scaling. The two main factors that are responsible for base skill damage on non-critical hits are weapon strength and power. You can find your weapon strength in the hero panel. It's randomly chosen from the interval that you see when you hover over the weapon that you're using. So we could say that the larger the interval of this is, the higher the variance of the damage. Daggers, for example, have lower weapon strength overall, but deal more consistent damage than greatswords. However, since weapon strength is fixed and you can't really influence this, we're going to treat this as a constant later on. A stat that you do have more influence on is power. Power is responsible for the base damage as well in Guild Wars 2 and scales linearly, so doubling the power means doubling the base damage. The value of power that you have is then simply multiplied with the weapon strength. A really straightforward way to increase your power, for example, is to increase your uptime on the Might boon, which increases your power by 30 for every stack you have, and since you can have 25 stacks at the same time, this gives you up to a maximum of 750 power. This is a really strong damage increase, so make sure you have this covered even in solo applications as much as you can. You can obtain power from lots of different sources, for example from gear, runes, sigils, traits, etc. Similar to all other primary attributes, power has a base value of 1000 points. The next factor that is multiplied with the ones we already have is the scaling coefficient. This is different for every skill in the game and is not shown in-game. You can find the scaling coefficients on the wiki though, by looking up a particular skill. You can see the coefficient right next to the damage number on top. The Revenant skill Vengeful Hammers, for example, has a scaling coefficient of 0.2 on its damage component. Finally, the whole formula is then divided by the target's armor. In PvP this obviously varies depending on the person you're fighting. A standard golem has an armor value of 2597 in the training area. Armor is defined as the sum of your toughness and defense. Toughness is a stat that can come from all kinds of different sources, while defense comes from your equipment, namely your armor and shields. So the formula for base damage that we're going to be working with from now on looks like this. We have weapon strength times scaling coefficients times power divided by armor. It's worth mentioning though that aside from these factors, we have a bunch of damage done and damage taken multipliers that act very inconsistently. Some are additive, others are not. Sigils, for example, stack additively with each other, but behave multiplicatively with traits and rune effects. Damage taken modifiers all behave multiplicatively. So while I would have liked to provide some kind of general rule for these, it seems that they are very inconsistent, as I said. Now let's move over to critical hits. There are two attributes that are important in this context. Precision determines the chance to hit critically on all strike damage, while ferocity determines the damage you deal in case you critically hit. Precision starts at a value of 5% critical chance. Every 21 points of precision on top of the base value of 1000 yield 1% additional critical chance. This means that generally for 100% critical chance, which is the cap for it, you need 2995 precision. Having access to the Fury boon, however, reduces this by 420 points, since it gives you 20% critical chance by default. So you'd only need 2575 precision to reach the cap. This changes again depending on the class you play and your group composition. Some group buffs coming from certain classes, such as the Spotter passive from the Ranger or the Banner of Discipline from the Warrior, increase the precision of allies around, so you will need even less critical chance to cap out. The other attribute is Ferocity. Ferocity starts at a base value of 50% critical damage and increases by 1% for every 15 points on top of the 0 points, which is the base value for the secondary attribute. As such, it is overall easier to acquire critical damage than critical chance. But you need to keep in mind that you have a much larger base value on Ferocity, 50% versus 5%, so even though critical chance has a lower conversion rate from stat increases, it is worth more in most cases simply because it nets you a higher damage gain. The formula for this part of the strike damage equation is pretty simple. You simply do 1 plus the critical hit chance times, in parentheses, the critical hit damage minus 1. The reason for the minus 1 is that on your character stat sheet you will find critical hit damage including the base damage. So as you can see here, the two stats interact multiplicatively. The more precision you have, the more benefit you get from additional ferocity and vice versa. So you want to have enough of both to make them worthwhile. This is one of the reasons why attribute combinations that grant both, for example Berserkers, Assassins, Diviners or Marauders, are so popular on builds that concentrate on strike damage, also often labeled as power builds. So in summary, the entire formula for strike damage looks like this. So in summary, let's look at some interactions between the stats. Since weapon strength, the scaling coefficient and armor do not depend on your character stats, we can treat them as a constant. Let's label that as X, which equals the weapon strength times the scaling coefficient divided by armor. This leaves us with the following formula, so we have X times the power times 1 plus the critical hit chance times the critical hit damage minus 1. So in practice, if you want to know which stat to focus on, simply maximize this formula for strike damage builds. Keep in mind that critical chance caps at 100% and that the additive nature of power gives it diminishing returns over time. The more you already have, the less relative gain in damage you'll receive from adding more. In practice, however, maximizing this formula is often very trivial. For DPS builds, you will usually go for a mix of Berserkers and Assassins because they are the best choice for group content, since they provide the best density out of the three important damage attributes. Classes that can cap out critical chance using full Berserkers will go for that, and other classes will just mix in some Assassins to keep crit maxed out. When you're looking at supportive DPS builds, for example an Alacrity Renegade, you would go for Diviner's gear to add in some boon duration until a certain threshold. In open world and solo applications, since you need some defense, you will often go for Marauders or Commander's gear because they add some defense or boon duration at the cost of relatively low damage output. In general, one can say that quadruple attribute combinations have a higher overall stat density than 3. They grant you more points in total, but less points per attribute. So yeah, that's basically it. I hope you now have a better understanding of how strike damage works in Guild Wars 2. In order to verify the overall formula that I used here, I'm going to provide a couple of practical examples in the Special Forces training area. For these tests, I'm going to use a warrior build with a greatsword skill Blade Trail. I'm going to get into why I use that skill later on. If we look at the Blade Trail skill, we can see that the tooltip is 318 damage, and from the wiki we can learn that the damage has a scaling coefficient of 0.75 on power. The average of the greatsword weapon strength is 1100, the base power value is 1000, the golem used here has 2597 armor, so the damage based on the formula matches the 318 from the in-game tooltip. In order to verify whether this is true, I hit the golem with a skill about 30 times. Moving on. And got an average damage value of 319, so we can see that it matches the tooltip and the calculations pretty nicely. I then repeated the test 100 times with a sigil of force on the weapon and the trait Destruction of the Empowered, which grants 3% additional damage for every boon on the target. I applied 7 boons to the golem, so assuming multiplicative interaction, the expected gain in damage would be 27.05%. Applying that to the value we got before, it would be a base damage value of 405. After those 100 hits, the average I got was exactly 405, so again, it matches the calculations. The final test concerns critical hit damage. Adding in Assassin's Present from the Revenant adds 150 ferocity, so 10% critical hit damage, putting it to 160%. The reason why I used the skill Blade Trail is that it snapshots the same damage on the first and second hit, but both hits are able to critically strike. So I simply waited for one of the hits to critically strike and the other not to, so I could check the damage gain on the critical hit. In this case I got a non-critical hit of 397 and a critical hit of 635. This is a relative gain of 60%, so very close to the hero panel and the calculations. So now you know how strike damage in Guild Wars 2 works, this is it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm, and see you next time.